June 1940. London was a city under siege, its streets thick with the smell of smoke and fear. The world's most powerful empire was on the edge of total collapse. For Americans watching from across the Atlantic, the headlines were almost unbelievable. The British Army, once thought invincible, had just suffered a disaster so complete it threatened to end the war before it truly began. Winston Churchill, Britain's new Prime Minister, stood at his office window in Whitehall, staring down at the battered soldiers limping through the city. These weren't the proud, polished troops of British legend. These were men who had barely escaped with their lives from the beaches of Dunkirk, a name that would soon become a symbol of both miracle and catastrophe. Their uniforms were torn, their faces hollow. Most carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their rifles, helmets, and hope had been left behind in France, now in enemy hands. The numbers were staggering. On those French beaches, the British left behind 75,000 vehicles, almost their entire motor pool. They abandoned 2,400 artillery guns and 68,000 tons of ammunition. To put that in perspective, before the war, Britain only owned about 80,000 military vehicles in total. Now, nearly all of them were lost, waiting for German soldiers to turn them against their former owners. For anyone in America reading the morning papers, it was clear. Britain was bleeding out, and the sharks were circling. Churchill checked his pocket watch. It was 3:00 p.m. A moment burned into his memory. In exactly 1 month, according to German intelligence, Hitler would launch Operation Sea Lion, the code name for the invasion of Britain. Across the English Channel, the German war machine was gathering. 3,000 tanks, more than any army in the world, stood ready to roll. On the British side, just 14 tanks remained operational. 14. The math was brutal. For every British tank, the Germans had over 200. But the nightmare didn't end there. The Royal Air Force, Britain's last line of defense, was running on fumes. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, the man in charge of fighter command, entered Churchill's office with a grim look and a folder full of bad news. Only 331 Hurricane and Spitfire planes could still fly. The Germans had over 2,000 bombers and fighters ready to strike. The skies above England were about to become a killing ground. Outside, the city was a living portrait of defeat. Soldiers shuffled past, some with bandages covering their eyes, others limping on makeshift crutches. Nurses guided the wounded through the chaos. The mood was heavy, almost funereal. For the first time in centuries, the British people faced the real possibility of invasion, of their island fortress falling to a foreign enemy. In the United States, the debate raged. Was this the end of the old world? Could Britain possibly survive? American newspapers ran stories of British courage, but also of desperation. Some wondered if the time had come for the U.S. to step in, to send aid, or even to fight. Others argued that Britain was finished, that Hitler's victory was inevitable. The world watched, breath held, as the fate of democracy itself hung in the balance. Inside the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill gathered his cabinet. The walls were thick concrete, built to withstand the bombs that would soon rain down. Around the table sat the most powerful men in Britain, their faces pale with exhaustion and dread. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, broke the silence with a chilling suggestion. Perhaps it was time to negotiate peace, to accept defeat, to let Hitler have his way. Some nodded in agreement, their eyes haunted by the specter of another world war lost. But Churchill refused to surrender. He saw something the others, a glimmer of hope, a reason to keep fighting. As the world waited to see if Britain would stand or fall, Churchill made a decision that would change history. He would not give in. Not yet. Not ever. And as the sun set over London, painting the sky in blood red and gold, the question echoed from the bomb shelters of Britain to the bustling streets of New York and Chicago. Would this be the end of freedom in Europe? Or was there still a chance, however slim, that the tide could turn? What happened next would stun the world. Beneath the battered streets of London, in a secret warren of concrete rooms, the British War Cabinet gathered as the city above them braced for the next wave of German bombs. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every breath feel heavy. These were the men tasked with saving a nation, but on this night, even the bravest among them looked haunted. The world outside was crumbling, and inside the unthinkable was being discussed: surrender. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was the first to break the silence. His voice was calm, almost cold, as he laid out the facts. "Prime Minister, we must face reality. The French were right. They told us Britain alone would have her neck wrung like a chicken in 3 weeks. Perhaps it is time to explore peace negotiations. Mussolini might serve as a mediator between us and Hitler." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the table, heads nodded. Some of the most powerful men in Britain were ready to run, to evacuate the government to Canada, to abandon their homeland, to let Hitler's armies march through London unopposed. For Americans following the crisis, this was a moment of high drama. The world's oldest democracy, the birthplace of so many American ideals, was on the verge of giving up. Newspapers in New York and Washington speculated: would Britain really surrender? Was this the end of the line for freedom in Europe? The stakes could not have been higher. If Britain fell, the United States would stand alone against the Nazi threat. The future of the free world was being decided in a windowless room beneath the streets of London. But then, as the mood in the cabinet room sank lower, Churchill stood up. He pressed his hands flat on the table, his eyes blazing with a fire that refused to die. "Gentlemen, I have received a report today. A report about troops who are ready to fight, fully equipped, fully trained, high morale. Do you know who these soldiers are?" The room fell silent. No one could imagine where such troops might be found. The British Army was shattered. The Home Guard was barely more than a collection of old men and boys with hunting rifles. Churchill let the silence stretch, then delivered his answer. "The 1st Canadian Division, 7,449 men who sailed across the Atlantic Ocean last December. While our boys were fighting in France, the Canadians were here training. They have their rifles, they have their artillery, they have their trucks and equipment. They have everything our returning soldiers left behind on those beaches." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered. The Canadians, volunteers from across the ocean, men who had left the safety of their homes to fight for a country not their own, were now the best equipped, most combat-ready force in Britain. They had been training for 6 months, waiting for the call to action. They were not tired. They were not defeated. They were angry that they had not yet been allowed to fight. But not everyone was convinced. Lord Halifax shifted in his chair, skepticism etched on his face. "Colonial troops, Prime Minister. You would stake Britain's future on colonial troops who have never seen combat." The old prejudices ran deep. To some, the Canadians were outsiders, farmers and lumberjacks, not real soldiers. Churchill spun around, his voice rising. "I would stake Britain's future on men who crossed an ocean to stand with us. Men who could have stayed safe at home but chose to come here, knowing they might die. While we debate surrender, they sharpen their bayonets. While we consider peace with Hitler, they dig defensive positions in the rain. They did not come here to watch Britain fall. They came here to make sure it does not fall." The room was silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of men realizing that hope, however fragile, still existed. Churchill walked to a map on the wall and pointed to Oxford, where the Canadians were stationed. "General MacNaughton has positioned them at Oxford. It is the perfect location. Rail lines run from Oxford to every invasion beach on our south coast. If the Germans land, the Canadians can move fast to stop them. They are our mobile reserve, our strike force, our answer to Hitler's tanks." For Americans watching from afar, this was the kind of story that captured the imagination. The idea that a group of volunteers from across the Atlantic could tip the balance of history was electrifying. It was a reminder that the fight for freedom was never just about one nation. It was about all free people everywhere, standing together when it mattered most. As the meeting ended and the men filed out, Churchill stayed behind, staring at the map. His finger traced the long, dangerous journey from Canada to Britain, a journey that had changed everything. In that moment, he understood something vital. Britain was not alone, and as long as there were men willing to cross oceans for the cause of liberty, there was still a chance to turn the tide. What happened next would ignite a spark of hope not just in Britain, but across the free world. Who were these men Churchill was suddenly pinning the fate of a nation on? For most Americans, the idea of Canadian soldiers being the last line of defense for Britain was almost surreal. Canada, America's northern neighbor, was known for its vast forests, endless prairies, and polite, hockey-loving people, not for being the backbone of Europe's resistance against Hitler. But in the summer of 1940, the world was about to learn just how wrong that stereotype was. The Canadian 1st Division was no ragtag group of weekend warriors. These were volunteers, farmers from Saskatchewan, miners from Nova Scotia, lumberjacks from British Columbia, and city kids from Toronto and Montreal, who had left behind families, jobs, and the safety of home. They crossed the Atlantic at a time when German U-boats prowled the waters, sinking ships with ruthless efficiency. Every mile of ocean was a gamble with death, but the Canadians came anyway, driven by a sense of duty that echoed the American spirit of 1776. When they arrived in Britain, they found a country on the edge of panic. The British Army was in tatters, its equipment lost on the beaches of Dunkirk. But the Canadians had brought everything with them: rifles, artillery, trucks, even their own food and medical supplies. They were the only fully equipped, fully trained fighting force on the island. For 6 months, while the British scrambled to rebuild, the Canadians drilled relentlessly. They learned every road between Oxford and the coast, memorized maps, and practiced night maneuvers in total darkness. They trained in rain, mud, and cold, pushing themselves harder with every passing week. Yet despite their readiness, the Canadians faced skepticism and even outright prejudice from some British commanders. To the old guard, these were colonial troops, outsiders, untested in battle, not to be trusted with the fate of the empire. General Ironside, commander of Britain's home forces, scoffed at the idea of letting Canadians parade through London. It would be an insult to every British soldier who fought at Dunkirk, he argued. Others dismissed the Canadians as peacetime soldiers playing at war, unworthy of being called heroes. But Churchill saw something different. He saw men who had chosen to fight, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. He saw the same spirit that had built America, a willingness to risk everything for freedom, to stand up to tyranny even when the odds seemed hopeless. In private, Churchill confided to his closest aides that the Canadians were the difference between capitulation and victory. He knew that their presence alone was enough to make Hitler think twice. The Canadians themselves felt the weight of expectation. They were hungry to prove themselves, eager to show the world that they were more than just colonials. Lieutenant James MacDonald from Saskatchewan summed it up best when he told a British officer, "We didn't come all this way to watch. We came to fight." That attitude spread through the ranks like wildfire. The men trained harder, marched farther, and drilled longer than anyone expected. They became experts at loading artillery onto trains, ready to move at a moment's notice to any beach the Germans might try to invade. For Americans, the story of the Canadians in Britain was both inspiring and familiar. It echoed the tales of the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary challenges. It was a reminder that the fight for freedom was never just about one country. It was about a shared belief in something greater. The Canadians were proof that when democracy is threatened, free people everywhere will answer the call. As Churchill prepared to introduce the Canadians to the British public, he knew he was taking a risk. The old prejudices ran deep, and not everyone was ready to accept these outsiders as saviors. But Churchill also knew that desperate times called for bold moves. He was betting everything on the idea that courage, not birthplace, was what mattered most. The world was about to see what these Canadians were made of. And as the tension in Britain reached a breaking point, the stage was set for a moment that would change the course of history, not just for Britain, but for every free nation watching from across the Atlantic. What happened next would send shockwaves from London to New York, and prove once and for all that the fight for freedom knows no borders. The tension in London was electric. Rumors swirled through the city like smoke, whispers of surrender, of secret deals, of the government fleeing to Canada. But then, in the midst of all this uncertainty, Churchill made a move that stunned both his allies and his critics. He wanted the Canadians to march through the heart of London, not just as a show of force but as a message to the world. Britain was not alone, and the fight for freedom was far from over. The idea was explosive. In the war rooms, generals argued furiously. Some saw it as a slap in the face to British troops who had just returned from Dunkirk battered and broken. Others feared it would expose Britain's weakness, parading colonial soldiers as the nation's last hope. The debate grew so heated that voices were raised, fists slammed on tables, and some officers stormed out in anger. For Americans watching from across the Atlantic, the drama was gripping. The fate of a nation seemed to hang on a single parade. But Churchill was relentless. He believed that the world needed to see these men, volunteers who had crossed an ocean, risking everything to defend a country not their own. He saw the parade as more than just a military display. It was a declaration of unity, a rallying cry for every democracy still standing. Yet, even Churchill's determination wasn't enough to break the deadlock. The generals refused to budge. Then, in a twist worthy of a Hollywood script, Buckingham Palace intervened. King George VI, usually reserved and cautious, summoned Churchill for a private meeting. The king's message was clear and unmistakable. If Canadians are willing to die for London, London must see them march. I am ordering this parade to happen as king, as commander-in-chief. Those men came here to defend my capital. My people will see them. That is final. With the king's authority behind him, Churchill's vision became reality. July 4, 1940, Independence Day in America and now a day of defiance in Britain. At dawn, 7,449 Canadian soldiers assembled in Hyde Park. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots polished, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun. Each man wore full battle gear, helmets, gas masks, ammunition pouches, bayonets. They looked every inch the army of a free nation, ready to face whatever the enemy could throw at them. As the parade began, the sound of boots striking pavement echoed through the city like a drumbeat. Left, right, steady, unbroken, unstoppable. At first, only a handful of Londoners lined the streets, watching in silence. But as the column moved through the city, the crowd grew. Hundreds became thousands. People poured out of their homes, drawn by the spectacle and the hope it represented. Old veterans stood at attention, saluting as the soldiers passed. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders to see. Some waved small Canadian flags, others simply stared in awe. For weeks, London had lived in the shadow of defeat. The memory of Dunkirk was still raw, and the threat of invasion hung over every conversation. But as the Canadians marched past Trafalgar Square, past the Houses of Parliament, past Buckingham Palace, something changed. Tears streamed down the faces of men and women who had not cried in years. The city, battered and bruised, found its spirit again. Hope, long dormant, surged back to life. Churchill watched from Horse Guards parade, his heart pounding with pride. Beside him stood his aide, Major Hastings, both men silent as the Royal 22nd Regiment, French Canadians from Quebec, sang as they marched. Their voices rose above the noise, a song of defiance and unity. Churchill turned to Hastings, his voice thick with emotion. There marches the difference between capitulation and victory. When history asks who stood with Britain when she stood alone, the answer is marching before us. The parade was more than a show of military strength. It was a message to the world. Especially to America. Newsreels captured the spectacle, and soon images of the Canadians marching through London appeared in newspapers from Boston to Los Angeles. For Americans, it was a powerful reminder that the fight for freedom was not Britain's alone. Allies mattered. Solidarity mattered. The world was watching and the world was inspired. By noon, as the last Canadian soldier passed through central London, the city felt transformed. The air was different, charged with belief, with courage, with the sense that maybe, just maybe, the tide could turn. Hitler had his tanks and planes, but Britain had something else: friends who would cross oceans to stand by her side. The parade was over, but its impact would ripple far beyond the streets of London. It was a turning point, a moment when despair gave way to determination. And for Americans, it was a signal that the fight for democracy was far from lost. The world had seen the Canadians march, and nothing would ever be the same. What followed would test every ounce of courage these men possessed, and show the world just how much difference a single act of solidarity could make. After the parade, the mood in London shifted from despair to determination. But for the Canadians, the real test was just beginning. Churchill wasted no time. He ordered the Canadian troops to the front lines, Britain's last, fragile shield against Hitler's war machine. The world watched as these North American soldiers, so recently strangers to British soil, became the backbone of the island's defense. The Canadians fanned out across the southern coast, digging in along the beaches of Kent and Sussex. They set up machine gun nests behind concrete walls, placed artillery on windswept cliffs, and strung barbed wire across every possible landing site. Their orders were clear. If the Germans came, the Canadians would be the first to fight, and the last to fall. For Americans reading the headlines, it was a story that felt both foreign and familiar. The idea of ordinary men standing guard on distant shores, ready to defend freedom at any cost, echoed the spirit of Lexington and Concord. But these weren't just any soldiers. The Canadians brought with them a level of preparation and discipline that stunned even the most hardened British officers. Their equipment was state-of-the-art, their uniforms immaculate, their morale unbreakable. While British units struggled to recover from Dunkirk, the Canadians drilled day and night. They practiced loading artillery onto trains, rehearsed rapid deployments, and memorized every road and rail line between Oxford and the coast. If the invasion came, they would be ready to move at a moment's notice, striking fast, hitting hard, and never giving the enemy a chance to dig in. The contrast between the Canadians and the battered British forces was impossible to ignore. Where the returning Dunkirk soldiers wore patched uniforms and haunted expressions, the Canadians marched with heads high and eyes forward. Their boots fit, their rifles gleamed, and their ammunition pouches were full. They looked like an army that could actually stop Hitler's tanks. For the people of Britain, and for Americans watching from afar, the message was clear. Hope had arrived, and it wore a maple leaf. But the Canadians' presence did more than just boost British morale. It sent shockwaves through the German high command. Nazi intelligence officers, expecting to face a broken and demoralized enemy, were stunned to discover fresh, well-equipped troops holding key defensive positions. Reports filtered back to Berlin. New units here, and here, Canadian forces. Our agents report they are fully equipped and well-trained. Some German officers scoffed, dismissing the Canadians as farmers and lumberjacks playing soldier. But others weren't so sure. They saw the truth. These were professional troops ready for anything. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Hitler's generals began to doubt their invasion plans. Operation Sea Lion, once seen as a guaranteed victory, now looked like a gamble with terrifying odds. The Canadians had become a wild card, an unpredictable force that could tip the balance of power. In Berlin, the debate raged. Could Germany risk everything on an invasion that might end in disaster? Meanwhile, on the windswept beaches and rolling hills of southern England, the Canadians kept working. They dug trenches deeper, built stronger bunkers, and set up new lines of communication. Every week, more reinforcements arrived from Halifax, bringing fresh faces and fresh supplies. By August, there were 23,000 Canadian troops in Britain, more than the armies of many European countries. They brought their own trucks, their own food, their own medical teams. They didn't need Britain to supply them. They came ready to fight. Churchill visited the Canadians constantly, driving down muddy roads to watch them train, eating breakfast in their mess tents, shaking hands with soldiers and learning their names. He knew that these men were more than just reinforcements. They were a symbol of something bigger. They were proof that the fight for freedom was a global cause, that democracy's defenders would come from every corner of the world. For Americans, the story of the Canadians on the front lines was a powerful reminder of what was at stake. It was a story of courage, sacrifice, and solidarity, a story that resonated from the beaches of England to the streets of New York and Chicago. The Canadians weren't just fighting for Britain, they were fighting for the future of every free nation. As the summer wore on and the threat of invasion loomed ever larger, the Canadians stood ready. Their resolve never wavered. They knew that if the Germans came, they would be the first to face the storm. But they also knew that they were not alone. The world was watching and the world was inspired. What happened next would test their courage in ways no one could have imagined, and prove, once and for all, that the fight for freedom was far from over. As summer faded into fall, the skies over London darkened with a new kind of terror. The Blitz had begun. For weeks, the city had braced for it, sirens wailing, families huddling in bomb shelters, the distant thunder of explosions rolling in from the horizon. But nothing could prepare Londoners or the world watching from across the Atlantic for the reality of Hitler's wrath unleashed from above. On September 7, 1940, the first wave hit. Hundreds of German bombers roared over the city, dropping their deadly cargo on homes, factories, and schools. The ground shook. Buildings vanished in clouds of dust and flame. Night after night, the city burned, its skyline lit by fire and searchlights. For Americans reading the headlines, the images were haunting. London, the heart of the free world, under siege, its people refusing to break. But in the chaos, a new kind of hero emerged. The Canadians, who had marched through London just weeks before, now found themselves in the thick of the fight. Their anti-aircraft crews raced to their guns as the bombers approached, loading shells with practiced speed, aiming skyward through the smoke and darkness. The roar of their cannons echoed across the city, a defiant answer to the enemy above. On that first day alone, Canadian gunners shot down 6 German planes, each one a small victory in a night of terror. Yet the battle didn't end when the bombs stopped falling. As dawn broke over a city scarred by fire, the Canadians shifted from warriors to healers. Field hospitals sprang up in parks and school buildings. Doctors and nurses, many of them barely older than the soldiers they treated, worked through the night, tending to the wounded. Burns, broken bones, cuts from flying glass, every injury was met with steady hands and quiet courage. In the first week of the Blitz, Canadian medical teams treated over 2,000 casualties. They worked until their hands shook from exhaustion, then kept working. For Americans, the story of the Blitz was more than just another chapter in the war. It was a test of everything the free world believed in: resilience, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will to fight on. The Canadians embodied that spirit. Rain or shine, bomb or blackout, they dug deeper trenches, built stronger defenses, and stood their ground. Churchill himself visited their positions, braving the mud and the danger to see the men who had become Britain's shield. He watched them work, listened to their stories, and drew strength from their resolve. One rainy afternoon, Churchill found himself standing beside a young private from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, as the soldier filled sandbags in the pouring rain. "Long way from home," Churchill remarked. The private didn't look up. "My grandfather fought at Vimy Ridge in the last war, sir. He told me, when you cross an ocean to fight for something, you don't turn around and go home until the job is done." We didn't come here to quit. The words stuck with Churchill. They were a reminder that the fight for freedom was never easy, never safe, but always worth it. Inside the war cabinet, the debate raged on. Some still whispered about peace, about surrender, about finding a way out. But Churchill, hardened by what he'd seen on the front lines, would have none of it. "I visited our Canadian defenders today," he thundered. "I watched them dig in the rain. I saw them treat our wounded. I heard them shoot down German planes. And I spoke with a young man who told me his grandfather fought at Vimy Ridge. He said they did not cross the ocean to quit. These men have more resolve than our entire peace party. We will not surrender. We will not negotiate. We will fight until we win." The room fell silent. No one argued. The Canadians had become more than just soldiers. They were a symbol of hope, a living answer to the question of whether democracy could survive the storm. For Americans, their story was a call to action, a reminder that the fight for freedom was not just Britain's fight, but everyone. As the Blitz raged on, the Canadians stood firm. They guarded the beaches, manned the guns, and cared for the wounded. They became the backbone of Britain's defense, the proof that tyranny could be resisted, that courage could outlast fear. And as the world watched, the legend of the Canadians grew, an inspiration to every free nation and a warning to every would-be conqueror. What happened next would change the course of the war, and prove that when free people stand together, nothing is impossible. As the autumn leaves began to fall over England, the world waited for Hitler's next move. The German war machine had swept across Europe with terrifying speed, crushing everything in its path. France had fallen. Poland was gone. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, all under the Nazi boot. Now only a narrow strip of water separated Hitler from his ultimate prize, Britain. American newspapers ran maps showing the English Channel, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and asked the question on everyone's mind: would the Nazis cross? Inside German headquarters, the mood was tense. Hitler's generals gathered around massive maps, tracing lines from Calais to Dover, from Cherbourg to Portsmouth. Operation Sea Lion, the code name for the invasion of Britain, was ready on paper, but reality was proving far more complicated. Reports from Nazi spies and scouts painted a picture that didn't match their expectations. Instead of a broken, demoralized British army, they found something unexpected: fresh, well-equipped Canadian troops holding the most critical defensive positions. German intelligence officers were stunned. "New units here, and here, Canadian forces," one officer reported, his finger jabbing at the map. "Our agents say they're fully equipped, well-trained, and highly motivated." Some in the room scoffed, Canadians, farmers, and lumberjacks playing soldier, but others weren't so sure. The Canadians had already proven themselves in the skis, shooting down German bombers during the Blitz. They had shown discipline, courage, and a willingness to fight to the last man. The numbers were sobering. Hitler's planners estimated they would need at least 40 divisions to break through the Canadian and British defenses along the coast, but Germany only had 20 divisions available for the invasion. The math didn't add up. The risk was enormous. The losses could be catastrophic. For the first time, the Nazi high command began to doubt their own invincibility. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the propaganda machine spun a different story. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master of manipulation, took to the airwaves. His voice crackled over the radio, reaching both German and British ears. The British Empire is crumbling. Churchill begs for help from his colonies. He parades his colonial conscripts through London like circus animals. These farmers from Canada cannot save Britain. They are children playing with toy guns. Soon they will run home crying to their mothers. But behind closed doors, Goebbels and the rest of the Nazi elite knew the truth. The Canadians were no joke. They were a problem. British intelligence intercepted these broadcasts and sent transcripts straight to Churchill. He read them with a grim smile. Let the Nazis believe their own lies. The reality on the ground was very different. The Canadians were not only holding the line, they were changing the entire equation of the war. For Americans, this was a turning point that captured the imagination. The idea that a group of volunteers from across the Atlantic could force Hitler to rethink his plans was electrifying. It was a story of underdogs standing tall, of ordinary men making history. American newspapers ran headlines like "Canadians Hold the Line" and "Hitler's Invasion Stalled by North American Grit." The message was clear. The fight for freedom was global, and the tide was beginning to turn. By October, British intelligence had intercepted a message that sent shockwaves through the Allied command. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Hitler, frustrated and furious, turned his attention eastward, setting his sights on Russia instead. The invasion of Britain, the nightmare that had haunted London for months, was over, at least for now. The Canadians had done what many thought impossible. They had stood in the gap, held the line, and forced the most powerful army in the world to back down. Their presence had tipped the scales, buying precious time for Britain to rebuild, for America to prepare, and for the Allies to plan their next move. For the people of Britain and for Americans watching from afar, it was a moment of triumph. The world had seen what courage, solidarity, and determination could achieve. The Canadians had become legends, not just in Britain, but across the free world. But the war was far from over. The next chapters would demand even greater sacrifices, and the Canadians would be called upon again and again to prove their mettle. Yet in that autumn of 1940, as the threat of invasion faded and hope returned to the battered streets of London, one thing was clear. When free people stand together, even the darkest night can be turned back. What came next would test the limits of endurance and courage. But the world now knew that tyranny could be stopped, and that the fight for freedom was just beginning. The world had watched in awe as Canadian troops helped turn the tide in Britain's darkest hour. But their story didn't end with the retreat of Hitler's armies from the English Channel. In fact, the Canadians' legacy was just beginning, a legacy that would ripple across continents and generations, shaping the very idea of what it means to stand up for freedom. After the threat of invasion faded, the Canadians didn't pack up and go home. Instead, they became Churchill's fire brigade, always ready to rush to the hottest spots on the map. When the bombs fell and the fighting grew fiercest, it was often the Canadians who were sent in first. Their courage became legendary, not just in Britain, but in every corner of the free world. In December 1941, as the war spread to the Pacific, Canadian soldiers sailed to Hong Kong to defend the city against a massive Japanese assault. The odds were hopeless, but the Canadians fought with a ferocity that stunned even their enemies. Many were killed or captured, spending years in brutal prison camps. But their sacrifice bought precious time for civilians to escape, and their stand became a symbol of resistance that echoed all the way to America's west coast. Then came Deep, August 1942, a name that would haunt military planners for years. In a daring raid on the French coast, 5,000 Canadians stormed the beaches at dawn, facing a wall of German machine guns. The result was a bloodbath. More than half were killed, wounded, or captured in just 9 hours. On the surface, it looked like a disaster. But the lessons learned at Deep would save thousands of lives on D-Day, when Allied forces finally returned to liberate Europe. The Canadians paid the price so others could succeed, a sacrifice that did not go unnoticed in American war rooms. By 1943, Canadian forces were fighting their way up the rugged mountains of Sicily and Italy, battling mud, rain, and fierce German resistance. They captured town after town, pushing the enemy back mile by bloody mile. Their determination inspired American GIs fighting alongside them, forging bonds that would last long after the war was over. And then on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Canadians took center stage. 14,000 Canadian soldiers stormed Juno Beach, facing concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and relentless machine gun fire. They pushed further inland than any other Allied force that day, opening the way for the liberation of France. From Normandy, they fought through Belgium, Holland, and into Germany itself, never stopping until the Nazi regime was crushed. The cost was staggering. By the end of the war, nearly 47,000 Canadian soldiers had given their lives. 60,000 more carried wounds, some visible, some hidden, that would last a lifetime. For a country of just 11 million people, the sacrifice was enormous. In some towns, nearly every young man was lost, but their courage changed the world. And their impact didn't stop on the battlefield. Canada became the arsenal of democracy, building 800,000 military vehicles, including 50,000 tanks, for the Allied war effort. Canadian factories churned out guns, bullets, and planes. Canadian farms fed Britain when German submarines tried to starve the island into submission. Canadian airfields trained 125,000 pilots and aircrew, many of whom would fly alongside Americans in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. After the war, the lesson of Canadian solidarity became the foundation for a new world order. In 1949, Canada joined the United States and 10 other nations to form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty was a direct echo of what the Canadians had shown in 1940. An attack on one is an attack on all. If anyone threatened America, Canada would stand by her side. If Britain was attacked, Americans and Canadians would fight together. The principle was simple but powerful. Stand together, fight together, win together. And that principle has endured. When terrorists struck America on September 11, 2001, Canadian troops were among the first to deploy to Afghanistan, fighting shoulder to shoulder with U.S. forces for over a decade. When Libya needed protection from a brutal dictator in 2011, Canadian pilots flew 10% of all NATO missions, and a Canadian general led the entire operation. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Canada sent weapons, money, and trainers, continuing the tradition of punching above their weight for the cause of freedom. For Americans, the story of the Canadians is more than just a chapter in history. It's a reminder that the fight for liberty is never fought alone. It's a story of neighbors who became brothers in arms, of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, of a nation that chose courage over comfort and solidarity over safety. The legacy of those Canadians who marched through London in 1940 lives on, in every alliance, every act of shared sacrifice, every moment when free people stand together against tyranny. Their story is a beacon, lighting the way for all who believe that democracy is worth defending, no matter the cost. And as long as that spirit endures, the world will always have hope. As the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked back on a war that had changed everything. But for those who truly understood what had happened, the most important lesson wasn't written in the names of battles or the numbers of tanks. It was written in the choices of ordinary people, choices that echoed from the beaches of Dunkirk to the streets of London, from the factories of Detroit to the wheat fields of Saskatchewan. It was the lesson of solidarity, and it would shape the destiny of nations for generations to come. Winston Churchill, standing before the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, captured it with a single unforgettable phrase. He remembered the dark days after Dunkirk when the world believed Britain would fall. He remembered the French prediction that Britain's neck would be wrung like a chicken. But then he smiled, his voice ringing with pride. Some chicken, some neck. The room erupted in laughter and applause, but the meaning was clear. Britain had not stood alone. The free world had answered the call. For Americans, this story was more than just a tale of distant allies. It was a mirror reflecting the very ideals that built the United States: freedom, courage, and the unbreakable belief that when liberty is threatened anywhere, it must be defended everywhere. The Canadians who marched through London in 1940 didn't just save Britain. They inspired a movement that would bring the world's democracies together in a way never seen before. Their march was more than a parade. It was a declaration, a living, breathing answer to tyranny. It showed that democracy isn't just a system of government. It's a bond between people who choose to stand together, even when the cost is high. The sight of those young men, marching with heads held high, rifles gleaming and maple leaves on their shoulders, sent a message that rippled across the Atlantic. It told Americans and the world that the fight for freedom was not a lonely struggle. It was a shared mission, a cause that transcended borders and backgrounds. That spirit of unity became the foundation for everything that followed. It shaped the creation of NATO, the rebuilding of Europe, and the defense of democracy during the Cold War. It inspired Americans and Canadians to fight side by side in Korea, in Afghanistan, and wherever freedom was threatened. It's the reason why, when disaster strikes or tyranny rises, the world still looks to the partnership between the United States and Canada as a beacon of hope. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of that moment in 1940 is the reminder that history is shaped not just by leaders and generals, but by the choices of ordinary people. The Canadians who crossed the ocean didn't have to go. They chose to. They chose to risk everything for a country that wasn't their own, for a cause that belonged to all free people. Their courage inspired others, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Americans, to join the fight. One act of solidarity became a tidal wave that changed the course of history. For Americans today, the lesson is as urgent as ever. The world remains unpredictable. New threats emerge, old hatreds resurface, and the future can seem uncertain. But the story of the Canadians in 1940 is proof that when free people stand together, there is no force on earth that can break them. It's a call to remember that democracy is not a gift handed down from the past. It's a responsibility, renewed every time we choose unity over division, courage over fear, and action over apathy. So the next time you see the stars and stripes flying alongside the maple leaf, remember what it means. Remember the young men who marched through London, the sacrifices made on distant shores, and the unbreakable bond forged in the fires of war. Remember that the power of solidarity is not just a lesson from history, it's the secret weapon of every free nation. Because in the end, the difference between victory and defeat, between darkness and dawn, is not just strategy or firepower. It's the willingness of ordinary people to stand together when it matters most. That's what Churchill saw that July morning. That's what the world saw when the Canadians marched. And that's what will keep the flame of freedom burning for generations to come.